All right, folks, we are back here on WLTH 1370 AM. Hope you enjoyed The Godfather of Go-Go, Chuck Brown, Ashley's Roach Clip. That song's been sampled by so many people so many times. Wow. It's like history. It's listening to history. But we are back here on My Country with Scott Cannon here on Issues and Answers Friday. And we're back with our to finish up our coverage of the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. Before we get back to that, let me take this call really quick. Hello, caller.
Hey, Scott.
What's up?
I'm telling you, you've been getting out a lot of information, a lot of correct information.
What's up?
But I just want to say this. Remember how you were talking earlier about civil rights with Dr. King and all of that?
Yes, yes.
Listen to me, man. The KKK, when we was down there, was paying blacks to kill blacks. Haven't your people in Jackson told you about that?
No, no. I didn't hear that, but wow.
No. That was all over out there in Camden and Pickens, all over Mississippi. Yeah, the Klans paying the blacks to kill blacks. Wow. The only way we found out about it because affirmers had told us about it. That's why we had to start being more cautious of what we were doing.
Wow.
Yeah. So that just, I said it a year or so ago, maybe a couple of years ago, not on your show, but on another show. And look, if I wouldn't have been hanging around the seniors, our parents, I would have not known yet that the Klan was paying blacks to kill blacks.
Wow. That's incredible. Thank you for adding that. Your contribution is greatly appreciated.
Believe me, not only I know about it, but somebody listening know about it also.
Yeah, if they know, please give me a call, 219-885-1371. Thank you for your call, brother. A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin began planning the March on Washington in 1961. At the time, they envisioned that it would be 2 days of protest, including sit-ins and lobbying, followed by a mass rally at the Lincoln Memorial. They wanted to focus on joblessness and call for a public works program that would employ black people. In early 1963, they called publicly for a massive march on Washington for jobs. They received help from Stanley Aronowitz of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and he gathered support from the radical organizers who could be trusted not to report their plans to the Kennedy administration. The Unionists offered tentative support for a march that would be focused on jobs. Again, we're back to labor. We're back to labor unions. We're back to unionists. This does not go down without organized labor and the unionists. On May 15th, without securing the cooperation of the NAACP or the Urban League, Randolph had announced the October Emancipation March on Washington for jobs. He had reached out to union leaders, winning the support of, at this point, United Auto Workers Walter Reuther, but not of AFL-CIO President George Meany. And this means a lot because at this point, A. Philip Randolph had been the AFL-CIO Vice President. So this had to be a little bit difficult for A. Philip Randolph. Randolph and Rustin intended to focus the march on economic inequality, stating in their original plan that integration in the fields of education, housing, transportation, public accommodations will be of limited extent and duration so as long as fundamental economic inequality along racial lines persists. As they negotiated with other leaders, they expanded their stated objectives to jobs and freedom, to acknowledge the agenda of groups that focused more on civil rights. In June of 1963, several leaders from several organizations formed the Council for United Civil Rights Leadership, an umbrella group to coordinate funds and messaging. This coalition of leaders, who became known as the Big Six, included Randolph, who was the head of the march, James Farmer, who was the president of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, John Lewis, the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Dr. Martin Luther King, who was the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Roy Wilkins, the president of the NAACP, and Whitney Young, who was the president of the National Urban League. Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young initially objected to Rustin as a leader for the march and were worried that he would attract the wrong attention because he was gay and a former communist and a draft resistor. They eventually accepted Bayard Rustin as an organizer on the condition that Randolph act as the lead organizer and manage any political fallout. You got to understand, back in those days, being a communist, gay, and black was like being, Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot in this country. About 2 months before the march, the Big Six broadened their organizing coalition by bringing on board 4 white men who supported their efforts. Walter Reuther, the president of the United Automobile Workers, Eugene Carson Blake, the former president of the National Council of Churches, Matthew Amon, the executive director of the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice, and Joachim Prince, who was the president of the National Jewish Congress. Together, the Big Six plus 4 became known as the Big Ten. On June 22nd, the organizers met with President Kennedy, who warned against creating an atmosphere of intimidation by bringing a large crowd to Washington. These activists persisted on holding this march. Wilkins pushed for the organizers to rule out civil disobedience and described this proposal as the perfect compromise. Martin Luther King Jr. and Whitney Young agreed. Leaders from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Congress of Racial Equality, who wanted to conduct direct actions against the Department of Justice, endorsed the protest before they were informed that civil disobedience would not be allowed. Finalized plans for the march were announced in a press conference on July 2nd, and John F. Kennedy spoke favorably of the march on July 17th, saying that the organizers planned a peaceful assembly and had cooperated with the Washington, D.C. police. This march was not universally supported among civil rights activists. Some, including Rustin, were concerned that it might turn violent, which could undermine pending legislation and damage the international image of the movement. The march was condemned by Malcolm X. A lot of people don't know that. Malcolm X was not down for this march. He was still the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam at this point, and he called it the farce on Washington. In his message to the grassroots speech, Malcolm X criticized the march, describing it as a picnic and a circus. He said the civil rights leaders had diluted the original purpose of the march, which had been to show the strength and anger of black people by allowing white people and organizations to help plan and participate in the march. March organizers disagreed about the purpose of the march. The NAACP and the Urban League saw it as a gesture of support for the civil rights bill that had been introduced by the Kennedy administration. Randolph King and SCLC believed it could raise both the civil rights and economic issues to national attention beyond the Kennedy bill. CORE and SNCC believed that the march could challenge and condemn the Kennedy administration's inaction and lack of support for civil rights for African Americans. Despite their disagreements, the group came together on a set of goals: passage of meaningful civil rights legislation, immediate elimination of school segregation. Now, at this point, the Supreme Court had already ruled that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education. They also agreed on a program of public works, including job training for the unemployed. They agreed on a federal law prohibiting discrimination in public or private hiring. They agreed on a $2 minimum wage nationwide, which today, as we talked about before on this show, would be the equivalent of $19 an hour. withholding federal funds from programs that tolerate discrimination, enforcement of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution by reducing congressional representation from states that disenfranchise citizens. That's an important one. A Fair Labor Standards Act that broadened to include employment areas then excluded authority for the Attorney General to institute injunctive suits when constitutional rights of citizens are violated. To avoid being perceived as radical, organizers rejected support from communist groups, which is a shame. And I'm going to tell you why it's a shame that they rejected support from communist groups. Because communists were some of the very first people to support civil rights for African Americans. I'm going to do a show at some point about the Haymarket bombing of 1888 on May Day. And you will see that even back then in the 19th century, the communists always supported civil rights for black people in this country. The communists, the socialists, even when a lot of labor unions were racist and full of white supremacists who did everything they could to keep black people out, the communists and the socialists supported black people's rights. So you understand now why you would see signs during segregation that would say race mixing is communism and things like that. You understand why they hated the Soviet Union so much when they invited Paul Robeson to go out there to Russia and treated him like he was a full citizen and treated him better in their country than he was treated here. And you understand why a lot of black African Americans left this country to immigrate to Russia during the 20th century. There is a whole class of African Americans who did just that and were, again, integrated into the Soviet Union during the 20th century. To this day, Patrice Lumumba from the Congo, there is a square in Moscow named after him. The United States helped kill him. Just remember that. Strom Thurmond actually launched a prominent attack on the march as communist. Here we go again, Strom Thurmond, a man that our current president, Joe Biden, eulogized at his funeral. That's Strom Thurmond. He launched a prominent public attack on the march as communist and singled out Rustin in particular as a communist and a gay man. Oh, well. Representatives from each of the sponsoring organizations addressed the crowd from the podium at the Lincoln Memorial. The speakers, who were dubbed the Big Ten, included the Big Six, 3 religious leaders, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, and labor leader Walter Reuther. None of the official speakers were by a woman, and that was a mistake. That, I will say, was a big mistake. And a mistake that many in the civil rights and black power movements made during the 60s and 70s. It was good to see that Huey Newton, actually, of the Black Panther Party, when he went to Cuba, when he had to leave America, he actually left Elaine Brown in charge. He left Elaine Brown in charge, and his reasoning for leaving Elaine Brown in charge of the Panthers was because he said that a lot of the brothers in the Black Power movement and in the civil rights movement were sexist. And he thought that they needed to be able to take orders from a woman for a while. So, so we see that even here in 1963, this is some years before that, this is like 10 years before that, but we see that even as we're talking about justice, they are leaving the voices of our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, our wives, our girlfriends, our friends, our, teachers, all these people out of it. You're leaving half of the population out of it, at least in having a prominent position in that situation. None of the official speeches were by women. Josephine Baker actually gave a speech during the preliminary offerings, but women were limited in the exchange of the official program to a tribute led by Bayard Rustin, at which Daisy Bates also spoke briefly. Floyd McKissick read James Farmer's speech because Farmer had been arrested during the protest in Louisiana. farmer had wrote that protests would not stop until the dogs stopped biting us in the South and the rats stopped biting us in the North. The order of the speakers was as follows: A. Philip Randolph, who was the march director; Walter Reuther from the United Auto Workers and AFL-CIO; Roy Wilkins from the NAACP; John Lewis from the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee; Daisy Bates; Dr. Eugene Carson Blake from the United Presbyterian Church and National Council of Churches; Floyd McKissick from CORE; and Whitney Young. Several smaller speeches were made, including by Rabbi Joachim Prince, American Jewish Congress, Matthew Amman, National Catholic Conference, and Josephine Baker, who was a dancer, obviously, Dr. Martin Luther King from the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and his I Have a Dream speech obviously had become celebrated for its vision and excellence. The closing remarks were made by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, the march organizers, leading with the pledge and a list of demands. Now, it's important to understand that there were also speakers who were excluded from the March on Washington, like James Baldwin. James Baldwin was actually prevented from speaking at the march on the grounds that his comments would be too inflammatory. And also, despite the protest of Anna Arnold Hedgeman, no women gave a speech at the march, as I said earlier. The celebrities at this event were numerous. Josephine Baker, as I said earlier, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, James Baldwin, Jackie Robinson, Sammy Davis, Dick Gregory, Eartha Kitt, Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, Diane Carroll, and Lena Horne were among the black celebrities attending. There were also quite a few white and Latino celebrities who attended or helped fund the march in support of the cause. And it's always important to give the people who are not black credit when they go along with this, because they don't have to be involved. They could just sit there and coast on their privilege if they want. But Tony Curtis, Jamie Lee's father, was always a big supporter of the civil rights movement. James Garner as well. Charlton Heston, Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, Rita Moreno, Marlon Brando, Bobby Darin, and Burt Lancaster. Julie Garland was actually part of the planning committee and was scheduled to perform but had to drop out at the last minute. Now, the anniversary of the March on Washington has spurred many. There have been many of these anniversary marches that occur every 5 years. The 20th, the 25th being some of the best known. The 20th anniversary in 1983 was We Still Have a Dream, Jobs, Peace, and Freedom. And at the 50th anniversary march, President Barack Obama conferred a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom on Bayard Rustin and 15 others. On 2023, tomorrow, there will be a march held on Washington, D.C. on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. Organizers will include Martin Luther King III, his wife and Drum Major Institute President Andrea Waters King, daughter Yolanda, and National Action Network leader Reverend Al Sharpton. So that will actually be tomorrow. I'm sure you will probably be able to watch it at least online somewhere. If not, I'm sure something like NBC or CNN will be covering the 60th anniversary. We're going to go to a break really quick. But when we come back, I'm going to do something. One of the more important things I think I've ever done here on this show. I'm going to play the full speech. I'm going to play Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Stay with us here on WLTH 1370 AM.